How do you explain a crime scene that defies the very laws of existence? A body twisted in ways no human body should move, surrounded by symbols that shimmer like they're alive. For 17 years, I've seen death in every form imaginable. Gunshot wounds, strangulation, bloodied crime scenes that tell grim stories. But on the morning of November 13th, 2023, I walked into something that rewrote the rules of reality itself. My name is Detective Michael Sullivan, badge number 7249, Boston Homicide. Since 2006, I've worked the darkest corners of this city. Gangland executions in Dorchester, the Beacon Hill Strangler, 247 murders solved, 89 trials testified, 34 killers put behind bars. I thought I'd seen everything, but what I found at 43 Blackwood Avenue, that wasn't just a crime scene, it was a warning. It was 2:47 a.m. when the call came in. Routine, or so I thought. A breaking and entering turned homicide. Victim, Sarah Chapman, a trauma nurse at Mass General. Her colleague had called it in, worried after Sarah missed 3 shifts, a woman who hadn't been late in 6 years. But this wasn't the kind of case where you find answers. No, this was the kind that leaves you with questions you'll never want answered. When I arrived at 43 Blackwood Avenue, the frost on the windows didn't just look strange, it felt wrong, like it was watching me. The house was immaculate, untouched, no signs of forced entry, no struggle. And yet what I found inside wasn't human. That was the first time in my career I doubted everything I'd been taught about evidence, logic, reality. I'm not supposed to be telling you this. This case has been buried, classified beyond even my clearance. But the world needs to know. What I'm about to share will sound insane, impossible, but every word is true. If you ever find yourself face to face with what I saw that night, run. God help you. Just run. 17 years. That's how long I've walked Boston's darkest streets, untangling the web of violence and death that no one else wanted to face. My badge, number 7249, isn't just a symbol of duty. It's a testament to the stories I've pieced together, the killers I've cornered, families I've tried to give closure to. I've worked every kind of case this city could throw at me. Gang wars that turned entire neighborhoods into war zones. The Beacon Hill Strangler, a monster who left a trail of victims across 6 zip codes. Cold cases that sat gathering dust for decades until I found the missing thread. 247 solved murders. 89 courtroom battles where my testimony turned uncertainty into justice. 34 men and women now behind bars because the evidence spoke louder than their lies. But being a homicide detective isn't just about solving puzzles. It's about carrying the weight of every victim who couldn't speak for themselves. Every scene is a lesson. Blood patterns teach you physics. A killer's slip-ups give you psychology. And death itself, in all its forms, teaches you patience, precision, and a kind of resilience most people can't imagine. Still, I've always believed one thing. The evidence never lies. It may be silent at first, but if you know how to look, how to listen, it'll tell you the truth. That belief carried me through 17 years of relentless cases. And then on November 13th, 2023, it betrayed me. The scene at 43 Blackwood Avenue wasn't just inexplicable, it was impossible. Evidence that defied reason, logic, and every natural law I'd ever relied on. For the first time in my career, I wasn't staring at a crime, I was staring at something far worse. At 2:47 a.m. the call came in, a code 187. Homicide. Routine on paper, but something about the tone in the dispatcher's voice twisted in my gut like a bad premonition. Jamie, a rock-solid dispatcher with 12 years under her belt, sounded wrong. Too controlled, too steady, like she was holding back the edges of her own fear. Detective Sullivan, she said, her voice tight, almost robotic. We've got a confirmed homicide at 43 Blackwood Avenue. Victim, Sarah Chapman, age 34. Trauma nurse at Mass General. Colleague reported her missing after 3 days of no contact. Sarah Chapman, a name that would haunt me before I even knew her face. I'd learn later that she was one of Boston's finest in the trauma unit. Someone who had saved lives in situations where others had already written their patients off. Her hands had steadied the dying, stitched the broken, kept breathing going where it shouldn't have. But now, she was the victim. A woman who didn't just miss shifts, she didn't miss a beat. And yet, Her friend had tried calling her phone 22 times over 2 days with no answer. The last time anyone saw Sarah was on November 11th at 7:30 p.m, walking out of her shift, exhausted but smiling. She joked about hearing strange noises in her house, brushed it off as nothing, just old pipes or creaking floors. That's what people do, right? Explain away the impossible until it's staring them in the face. Jamie continued, listing off details. Locked doors, no signs of forced entry, and one chilling detail. A faint smell reported by a neighbour, something metallic mixed with bleach, faint enough to ignore but impossible to forget. It wasn't protocol for dispatchers to editorialise, but before she disconnected, Jamie added, "Sullivan, this one doesn't feel right. Be careful." She didn't need to say it. Every instinct I had was already screaming that this wasn't just a bad night. It was the start of something I wouldn't be able to walk away from. Sarah Chapman wasn't just another name on a report. She was the kind of person who made you believe in second chances, both for her patients and, maybe, for the world. 34 years old, a senior trauma nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, and by all accounts, the one you'd want by your side if your life was hanging by a thread. Her colleagues called her a miracle worker, someone who could coax life back when even hope had flatlined. But behind the steady hands and the calm under pressure, Sarah was just a woman trying to live a quiet life. She'd bought the house on Blackwood Avenue 3 years ago, a Victorian fixer-upper that she poured her weekends into. Fresh paint, rewired fixtures, restored woodwork. It was her sanctuary. At least, it was supposed to be. The people who knew her best said something had changed in the weeks leading up to her death. She'd become quieter, more withdrawn. At work, she still smiled, still saved lives, but there was a heaviness in her that hadn't been there before. She started mentioning things to friends, offhand remarks about strange noises in the night, rhythmic creaks, faint tapping sounds, whispers that seemed to move with her through the house. "Just the pipes," she'd say, brushing it off with a laugh. But Sarah wasn't the kind to scare easily. If she mentioned it at all, it meant it had gotten under her skin. Her journal, which we'd find later, told a different story. She'd been documenting the noises meticulously, patterns, intervals, even sketches of the shadows she swore she saw shifting along her walls. She tried to make sense of it in the way she knew best, methodically, like she was charting a patient's vitals. But the last entry in that journal? It wasn't a chart or a diagram. It was a single line, scrawled in frantic, uneven handwriting. "They're inside now." Sarah Chapman was someone who dedicated her life to saving others, yet no one could save her from whatever found her in that house. Not her friends, not her colleagues, not even me. From the moment I turned onto Blackwood Avenue, the house stood out like a wound in the dark. Victorian style, pristine and symmetrical, but there was something unnatural about it, like it had been plucked from another time and dropped here, untouched by the years around it. The frost on the windows shouldn't have been possible. November in Boston is cold, sure, but not this cold. The air felt wrong, dense and heavy, biting at the skin like it wanted to leave a mark. The frost patterns weren't random either. They ran in lines too straight, shapes too deliberate, as if someone, or something, had etched them from the inside. And then there was the vapor from my breath. Every exhale hung in the air longer than it should have, twisting in precise spirals before dissipating unnaturally. The house was immaculate. Dark blue paint, white trim, brass fixtures polished to a mirror's shine. Too perfect, too deliberate, like a set piece in a play. Even the morning glory vines climbing the porch seemed staged, not a single leaf out of place. The motion sensor light flickered as I approached, but not in the usual erratic way. It blinked in bursts, 3 short flashes, pause, then 2 more. A pattern, one that made my head ache the longer I stared at it. As I got closer, I realized the temperature wasn't just cold, it was wrong. The air around the house seemed to hum, a low vibration I could feel in my bones. And then, as if the house itself was aware of me, the front door creaked, ever so slightly, though the wind wasn't strong enough to move it. Standing there, staring up at that perfect facade, I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in years. Hesitation. Something in my gut told me to turn around, to leave. But the badge on my hip had been with me long enough to silence that voice. I stepped forward, past the motion light, and felt the cold press against my skin like an unwelcome greeting. I hadn't even crossed the threshold, and already I knew whatever waited inside wasn't going to be human. Officer Miguel Rodriguez was waiting near his squad car when I arrived, and the look on his face stopped me in my tracks. I've known Rodriguez for over a decade. He's the kind of cop who doesn't flinch at triple homicides or standoffs, the one who keeps his head when everyone else is losing theirs. But tonight, he looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and seen it blink back. "Detective Sullivan," he said, his voice cracking like he hadn't spoken in hours. His hand rested on his holster, fingers twitching, as if the weapon might offer some kind of comfort. You're going to want to see this yourself." Rodriguez handed me his body cam log, but even before I glanced at it, I noticed the shaking in his hands. Not subtle, not from the cold. This was something deeper, primal. He cleared his throat, tried to steady himself, but it didn't help. "Camera malfunction," he muttered, pointing to the log. "Cut out for about 7 minutes at 2:58 a.m. Just went black. No warning, no glitches before that. Nothing like I've ever seen." 7 minutes. I didn't need him to spell it out. In our line of work, 7 minutes can mean the difference between life and death. I asked him if he'd done a sweep of the house. He nodded, but the way his eyes darted back to the front door told me everything I needed to know. "There's something wrong in there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not the body, it's the house. It's like it knows we're here." I pressed him for details, but all he could do was shake his head. "You'll see," he said, taking a step back like he couldn't get far enough away. That's when I noticed the camera strapped to his chest still powered on, but the lens was cracked, spiderwebbed in a way that didn't match any kind of impact. It looked almost deliberate, like the damage had spread out from the center in symmetrical, unnatural lines. Rodriguez is a veteran. He doesn't rattle easy, but whatever he'd seen in that house had hollowed him out, left him shaken in a way no amount of experience could mask. As I turned toward the front steps, I could feel his eyes on me, like he wanted to call me back, to stop me, but he didn't. And I didn't look back. The front steps creaked softly under my weight, but the sound felt wrong, like it was swallowed by the air before it could fully echo. The porch was pristine, too pristine, the kind of meticulous order that screamed deliberate. No scuff marks on the welcome mat, no stray leaves caught in the corners. Even the brass doorknob gleamed, catching the faint glow of the motion sensor light that still blinked in that same unnerving rhythm. The door itself told no story. No scratches around the lock, no dents or signs of forced entry. The deadbolt was engaged, and the security system's panel beside the door showed it had been armed. If someone had come through here, they hadn't left a trace of how. I pushed the door open, and the first thing that hit me wasn't the temperature. It was the smell. Bleach, sharp and overpowering, mixed with something faintly organic, like damp earth that had been disturbed after lying still for centuries. It clung to the air, invasive and heavy, making it hard to breathe deeply. Inside, the house was immaculate. Not a speck of dust, not a picture frame out of place. The hardwood floors gleamed under the faint glow of the overhead light, but even that felt unnatural. The light flickered occasionally, not randomly, but in a way that seemed calculated, almost like a pulse. A Morse code I couldn't understand. I scanned the living room, the kitchen, the hallway leading toward the back. Everything was in its place, yet it felt wrong. It was like the house was trying too hard to convince me it was just a house. A perfect facade with no cracks to show what was underneath. Then I saw it. A single faint footprint near the base of the staircase, leading up. It was small, almost delicate, like a woman's, and the angle of the heel suggested someone had hesitated there just for a moment. But what chilled me was the detail. The print wasn't made from dirt or dust. It was outlined in something darker, something that shimmered faintly under the light, as if it was alive. I stood there, staring at that single mark, the house silent around me. I'd been in countless crime scenes, places where chaos painted every surface. But this was the kind of order that demanded attention. And as much as I wanted to turn back, I knew the answers weren't outside. They were waiting for me, somewhere deeper inside this immaculate lie of a house. The stairs groaned under my boots as I made my way up, each step feeling heavier than the last, like the house itself was pushing back against me. The air grew colder with every step, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and stays there. When I reached the second floor, the door to the master bedroom was ajar, and something told me that whatever I was about to see would stay with me forever. The room was bathed in an unnatural glow, faint and silvery, with no apparent source. The light seemed to pulse gently, as if it were alive, casting sharp, angular shadows that twisted across the walls. At first glance, everything looked pristine, like the rest of the house, but then I saw her. Sarah Chapman was on the bed, but calling it a bed felt wrong. It was more like an altar now. She was positioned unnaturally, her body arched backward in a way that defied anatomy. Her spine bent so sharply it seemed to hover above the mattress. Her arms stretched out to her sides, palms up, fingers curled like they were frozen mid-spasm. Her head was tilted back, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling with a lifeless intensity that made my stomach turn. But it wasn't just her positioning. Her skin seemed untouched, unmarked by any visible wounds, yet it glistened faintly, as if coated in a thin, translucent film. The longer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't reflecting light. It was absorbing it, pulling it in like the surface of a black hole. And then there were the symbols. They were carved into the walls, the ceiling, even the bed frame. At first glance, they looked like scratches, jagged and uneven. But as I moved closer, I saw the precision in them. Perfect lines and arcs that seemed to hum faintly with energy. The patterns weren't random. They were deliberate, repeating in sequences that tugged at the edges of my mind, like they were trying to communicate something just out of reach. The floor beneath the bed was marked too, a sprawling series of interconnected lines that formed an intricate geometric shape. My eyes traced the lines, and for a moment I felt dizzy, like the room was spinning, the symbols pulling at some unseen thread deep inside me. This wasn't a crime scene. It was something far worse. The precision, the perfection. It didn't just suggest intent. It screamed it. Something had done this to her. Something that didn't follow our rules of nature or physics. Standing there, I felt a strange, overwhelming sensation, like I was being watched, scrutinized by an unseen force that didn't belong in this world. And for the first time in my career, I questioned whether I was equipped to face what waited for me in that house. Because whatever had been here, whatever had done this, wasn't finished. And I had the sinking feeling it had been waiting for me all along. My first instinct was to step back, to turn around and recheck everything I knew about crime scenes. My training demanded logic, rules, patterns, things that made sense. But nothing here did. I stared at Sarah's body, frozen in an impossible arch, her lifeless eyes locked on something unseen above her. Every fibre of my being screamed that this couldn't be real, that there had to be an explanation hiding somewhere in the details. I scanned the room again, searching for the familiar, signs of a struggle, marks of forced positioning, anything to anchor this in reality. The bed was untouched, except for her. The sheets beneath her body were unwrinkled, as if she'd been placed there weightlessly. My eyes darted to the symbols carved into the walls. Maybe a cult, I told myself. Some ritualistic lunatic with a flair for theatrics. That could explain the markings. But even as I thought it, I knew it didn't fit. The precision of the carvings wasn't human. No tool marks, no inconsistencies. They looked like they had grown out of the surfaces themselves. I crouched to examine the floor beneath the bed, the geometric pattern pulling at my attention. My hand hovered over the lines, and the air around them felt warmer, thicker, as if the symbols radiated a presence of their own. I wanted to dismiss it as my imagination, a trick of adrenaline and exhaustion, but the sensations were too precise to ignore. I straightened, forcing myself to think clinically. The lack of wounds suggested asphyxiation, maybe poisoning. But if that were the case, why was there no physical distortion? No signs of struggle? I reached for my notepad, the motion automatic after years of habit, but my hand trembled as I wrote. The notes were disjointed, my own handwriting unsteady. No signs of trauma. Body appears suspended. Unknown substance on skin. Symbols. Alive. That last word burned on the page. Alive. I hated how easily it came to me, hated that I couldn't explain it away. But that's what they felt like. Alive. The symbols weren't just marks. They pulsed faintly, their edges shimmering in a way that defied light itself. and the way they drew my attention, the way they seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, made it impossible to think of them as anything else. I forced myself to step back, to reset. Evidence doesn't lie, I reminded myself. It doesn't whisper or hum or pull at you. It just exists, waiting to be decoded. But as I stood there, every logical deduction I'd built my career on buckled under the weight of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a crime, it was something I wasn't prepared to face. And for the first time in 17 years, I wasn't sure if I'd make it out of this house with my mind intact. When the medical examiner called me in, I could hear it in her voice before she said a word. Uncertainty, hesitation. Dr. Patel wasn't the kind to get rattled. Over 2 decades in her field, she'd seen enough to make even the most seasoned homicide detective flinch. But this time, she sounded lost. "Michael," she began, her tone sharp but uneasy. "I've completed the preliminary examination on Sarah Chapman. None of this makes sense." I braced myself, expecting the usual clinical breakdown, but what followed left me gripping the edge of the table. "There's no evidence of external trauma," she said. "No bruising, no ligature marks, nothing to suggest foul play." That much wasn't entirely shocking. But then she added, "Her spine, despite the position she was found in, arched nearly to the point of snapping, is completely intact. No fractures, no dislocations. It's as though her body defied gravity itself." I interrupted, asking about internal damage. Surely something inside had given way under the stress. But Dr. Patel shook her head. "Her organs are unremarkable. There's no hemorrhaging, no signs of strain. It's as if her body adapted to that position, impossible as that sounds." Her words hung in the air like a challenge to everything I understood. No broken bones? A human spine doesn't bend like that without snapping, let alone return to a perfect state. And then she dropped the next bombshell. "Her tissue samples," Patel continued, "show irregularities I've never seen before. The cellular structure, it's wrong. The connective tissues are denser than humanly possible, almost as though they were reinforced from within. And yet, her DNA doesn't show any signs of mutation or external tampering. It's human, but it's not." I asked about toxicology. There had to be something, a chemical, a drug, anything that could explain this. But the results only added to the absurdity. "There are traces of an unknown compound in her blood," Patel said, flipping through her notes. "It doesn't match any known substance. No chemical database has a record of it. Whatever it is, it's not from this world, or at least, not from anything we've catalogued." I sat in silence, my mind racing through the possibilities. Cult rituals, bioengineering, even the fringe ideas I'd once dismissed as conspiracy theories. But the evidence refused to align with any of them. Every detail contradicted the next, creating a puzzle with no edges, no framework to build from. Dr. Patel looked at me, her usual confidence replaced by something I'd never seen in her before: fear. "Michael," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Whatever happened to Sarah Chapman, it wasn't natural, and if this substance is what killed her, I can't promise it hasn't left something behind." Her words hit harder than any fact or figure she'd shared. For years I'd believed that every crime could be solved, every death explained. But this was a warning, delivered not by a killer, but by something far beyond our understanding. And as much as I wanted to leave it in the morgue, I knew it wouldn't stay there. The symbols were the only tangible evidence I had left to work with, and even then, they felt like a puzzle meant for a mind far beyond my own. Perfectly etched, impossibly precise, and humming with an energy that refused to stay confined to the walls of that house. I needed answers. Answers that weren't going to come from crime scene manuals or forensic databases. So I turned to someone whose expertise was as sharp as her skepticism. Dr. Catherine Y., a linguistics and mathematics professor at Harvard, wasn't the type to entertain anything outside the realm of cold, hard logic. When I handed her the photographs, I expected a dismissive shrug, maybe a snide remark about overthinking scratches on a wall. Instead, her reaction was unsettling. She stared at the images for a long time, her brow furrowed, her usually steady hand tracing the patterns on the paper like she was searching for something familiar. "These aren't just symbols," she finally said, her voice low, deliberate. "They're sequences, mathematical, almost algorithmic." She pulled out a notebook and began jotting down equations faster than I could follow. "See these arcs? They align with golden ratio curves. And these intersections, they mirror fractal patterns found in nature. Whoever, or whatever, made these wasn't just carving randomly. They were encoding something. She paused, her eyes narrowing as she leaned closer to one of the photographs. There's precision here that defies human capability. The lines aren't merely etched, they're seamless. No tool marks, no evidence of wear or pressure. It's as if they weren't carved, but grown into the material. The implications hit me like a freight train. Symbols that mimic natural phenomena, crafted with a precision beyond human hands. I asked if she could identify their origin, but her response only deepened the mystery. They don't belong to any known language or mathematical system, she said, shaking her head. But there's something else. She pointed to one of the patterns, a spiral that seemed to twist endlessly inward. Look at this. It's a Mobius loop, an infinite cycle. Whoever designed this understood concepts we've barely scratched the surface of. And then there were the photographs themselves. I'd taken them personally, ensuring every angle was clear, every detail captured. But the images Dr. Y examined showed something I hadn't seen in the room. Faint distortions, almost imperceptible, like the symbols were shifting within the photographs. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or a flaw in the print. But the more I stared, the more certain I became. They were moving. Slowly, deliberately, as if they were alive. Dr. Y sat back in her chair, her face pale, her usual confidence replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. Finally, she said, "Whatever these are, Detective, they weren't meant to be seen. And if they were meant to be understood, it wasn't by us." Her words echoed in my mind as I left her office. The symbols weren't just evidence, they were a message. But whether that message was a warning or a promise, I still couldn't tell. All I knew was that whatever left those markings wasn't finished. And it was only a matter of time before it made its next move. The journal was the last thing I expected to find, tucked away in a drawer that had no reason to stand out. It was an ordinary notebook at first glance, worn leather cover, the kind you'd pick up at a bookstore without a second thought. But as soon as I opened it, the air around me seemed to shift. The pages carried a faint metallic smell, as though they'd been exposed to something more than time. The early entries were what you'd expect. Neat handwriting, carefully dated, and filled with the daily musings of a woman trying to balance a demanding job with a semblance of a personal life. She wrote about long shifts at the hospital, a new recipe she wanted to try, a leaky faucet she hadn't gotten around to fixing. It painted a picture of a life that was, by all accounts, normal. But then the handwriting changed. The first sign was subtle. A slight tilt to the letters, the loops tighter, the strokes heavier. At first, I thought it was fatigue, maybe stress from work. But as the entries progressed, the shift became undeniable. The once organized lines began to slant, words crowded together as though written in haste or panic. Then the content changed. The entries became fragmented, scattered observations about the house. Hearing things again. Pipes, she wrote in one. Another read, footsteps when no one's here. Am I losing it? As the pages went on, her tone grew more desperate. It's not the pipes. It's something else. I can feel it watching me. The most unnerving part wasn't what she wrote. It was how she wrote it. The ink in the later entries had bled into the paper, as though the words had been pressed down with a force that didn't come from human hands. And the handwriting, it wasn't just hurried. It looked distorted, as though it was fighting the very act of being written. The final pages were almost incomprehensible. Symbols drawn over sentences, entire paragraphs crossed out, and at the very end, a single phrase repeated over and over, "They're here." The last line wasn't written in ink. It looked as though it had been etched into the page, the indentations so deep they nearly tore through the paper. I held the journal, my hands trembling despite myself. This wasn't just evidence. It was a window into Sarah's final days. And as much as I wanted to dismiss her words as the ramblings of a woman spiraling into paranoia, something inside me wouldn't let me. The things she described, the fear that seeped from every page, they weren't just her own. They mirrored everything I'd seen, everything I'd felt since walking into that house. The journal wasn't just a record. It was a message, a warning. And as I closed it, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story it told wasn't finished. Not for her, and not for me. The words in Sarah's journal weren't just entries. They were breadcrumbs, scattered across pages as she tried to make sense of what was happening around her. Her voice, clear in the beginning, became fragmented and raw, desperation bleeding through every line. She started with observations, small things that seemed harmless at first. A creak in the hallway at 2:13 a.m., one entry read, exactly the same time as last night. Another described faint tapping sounds, rhythmic and precise like a metronome but coming from the walls. At first she rationalized it as the old pipes settling, a draft pushing through the house, but the patterns were too deliberate. It's not the pipes, she wrote later, her words jagged, almost etched into the paper. The sounds repeat, exact intervals, 4 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. It's like a code. Her attempts to decode the patterns filled entire pages, diagrams sketched beside her notes. At one point, she connected the taps to mathematical sequences, referencing Fibonacci spirals and prime numbers. It wasn't random, she was certain of that. And then came the shadows. Something moved in the corner of my eye, she wrote in an entry that made my skin crawl. But when I turned, there was nothing there. It happens more often now, always at the edges of my vision, just out of focus. Another entry described the shadows as stretching, shifting, like they were testing the boundaries of the room. They're darker than they should be. It's not just an absence of light, it's like they're pulling light in. Her paranoia grew with each page. The once detailed accounts became scattered, as though her thoughts were slipping through her fingers faster than she could write them down. She began locking every door and window, even during the day. "The house isn't safe," she scrawled in bold letters, "but outside feels worse. It's everywhere." One entry, dated 2 days before her death, sent a shiver down my spine. "The symbols," she wrote, "I see them now, even when I close my eyes. They glow faintly, pulse like they're alive. They're in my head, repeating, repeating." And then the final entry. It was unlike anything else in the journal, almost unrecognizable as her writing. The lines were erratic, the ink smeared as though her hand had trembled violently while writing. The words were barely legible, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over, "It's coming for me." I closed the journal and stared at its worn cover, Sarah's voice still echoing in my mind. She had documented everything, every sound, every shadow, every moment she felt the walls closing in around her. But even with all her careful notes, the one thing she couldn't answer was why. And that was the part that stayed with me. Not just the fear, but the certainty that she'd seen something beyond our understanding, something that had been waiting in the spaces between logic and reason. The journal wasn't just a record of her descent. It was a map of a path I was now walking, whether I wanted to or not. The first time I saw the symbol outside the house, I thought it was a coincidence, a scribble on a piece of scrap paper left near my desk, a doodle maybe, something meaningless. But then I saw it again, etched faintly into the condensation on my bathroom mirror the next morning. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, and it was exactly like the ones in Sarah's bedroom. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was my imagination working overtime after staring at the photos and diagrams for days. But denial only lasted so long. The symbols began appearing everywhere. A faint outline in the frost on my car windshield, the exact same spiral repeated in the dust on my bookshelf. Once I even caught it shimmering faintly on the surface of my coffee, the liquid rippling as if disturbed by an unseen force. Then the dreams began. They weren't nightmares in the traditional sense. No monsters or violence, just presence. A darkness that stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the symbols glowing faintly, pulsing in a rhythm I couldn't escape. In every dream, I was walking toward them, drawn in against my will, each step heavier than the last. When I woke, the sensation lingered, a dull ache in my chest, as though I'd carried something back with me into the waking world. The strangest part was how the dreams affected me during the day. My memory started to slip. Little things at first, forgetting where I'd parked, struggling to recall a name I should have known. Then it got worse. I'd find myself standing in the middle of my apartment, not knowing how I got there, the taste of metal sharp on my tongue. The nights were no better. There was a constant hum in my apartment, just on the edge of perception, like the faint vibration of a tuning fork pressed against bone. It would grow louder when I tried to ignore it, forcing me to listen. And with it came the shadows, stretching, bending, moving where they shouldn't. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom after I woke to find one of the symbols carved into the wall above my headboard. It wasn't just drawn, it was burned into the plaster, the edges blackened and still faintly warm to the touch. I hadn't done it. I couldn't have. But there it was, staring back at me, daring me to deny its existence. The people around me started to notice. My colleagues would ask if I was sleeping, if I was feeling all right. I'd catch their glances lingering too long, concern etched into their faces. I wanted to tell them, to ask if they'd seen the symbols too, but I couldn't. How do you explain something you can't even understand yourself? Whatever this was, it wasn't just following me. It was inside me now, threading itself through every corner of my life, rewriting the boundaries of my reality. And the worst part? I could feel it growing stronger. It wasn't done with me yet. It was the third sleepless night when the thought hit me. What if Sarah's case wasn't the first? It felt like grasping at shadows, but the symbols, the patterns, the impossibilities, they were too specific, too deliberate to be an isolated incident. I needed answers. What I found instead were questions I wasn't ready to ask. I started with cold cases, the ones that never quite fit into neat categories. A triple homicide in Maine, unsolved since 2017. The crime scene photos showed markings carved into the floor, rough, uneven, but eerily similar to the symbols from Sarah's house. A disappearance in Rhode Island. A family of 4 vanished without a trace in 2020. The only clue left behind was a series of geometric etchings in the backyard dirt, dismissed at the time as kids fooling around. Then there was the case in Vermont, a fire that consumed an entire farmhouse. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but one of the surviving photographs from the scene showed a burned wooden beam. Scorched into its surface was a spiral identical to the one I'd seen glowing in my dreams. The more I dug, the clearer the connections became. The cases spanned years, even decades, scattered across New England like breadcrumbs. Different circumstances, different victims, but always the same symbols. Always the same impossibilities. But it wasn't just the patterns that unsettled me. It was the suppression. Files redacted beyond recognition, key details missing from reports, witnesses who'd recanted their statements without explanation. I reached out to an old contact in records, and she confirmed what I'd already suspected. Someone, somewhere, had been burying these cases. I tried to map the locations, hoping for some kind of logic, but the results only deepened the mystery. The sites weren't random, but they weren't predictable either. Each one sat near a natural fault line or a magnetic anomaly, places where the Earth's energy twisted in ways we barely understand. It was as though something had chosen these spots, drawn to them for reasons I couldn't begin to grasp. But the part that kept me awake wasn't the geography or the patterns. It was the growing certainty that this wasn't about the victims. Not entirely. It felt larger, like these people, these places, were pieces in a game too vast for any of us to see the board. And then came the fear. Not just for myself, but for the people around me. For the first time in my life, I didn't trust my own shadow. I began to question everyone and everything, wondering if the symbols were in them too, if they had seen the same patterns and felt the same pull. Every door I owned led to another, darker one, and the walls of my reality began to feel paper thin. I wanted to stop. To close the files, walk away, pretend I hadn't seen the connections. But once you've seen the pattern, you can't unsee it. The symbols don't just follow you, they change you. And now I understood what Sarah must have felt in those final days. That sinking, unshakable certainty that the world you knew was no longer yours. And worse, that it never had been. If you've made it this far, you know this isn't just a story. It's not an unsolved case or a collection of strange coincidences. It's a warning. What I've told you is only a fraction of what I've seen, what I've felt. And if the symbols have appeared to you, if you've noticed patterns you can't explain, shadows moving where they shouldn't, or sounds that seem to know your name, don't ignore them. Don't rationalize them away. Because once they've touched your life, they don't stop. They don't leave. They're patient, and they're watching. Here's what you need to do. First, document everything. Every sound, every mark, every fleeting moment that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Write it down, draw it, take pictures if you can. Not because it'll save you, but because you'll need to remember. The symbols will try to erase themselves from your mind to convince you they were never there. Second, don't confront them. Don't try to understand, to decode, to piece together the puzzle. That's what they want. Every question you ask pulls you deeper, makes you a part of the pattern, and the deeper you go, the harder it is to come back. Third, and this is the hardest part, tell someone. Even if they don't believe you, even if they laugh in your face, you have to let someone else know. Because once you're alone with it, it will find you. And when it does, there's no one left to pull you back. I can't promise you'll be safe. I can't promise any of us are. But I can promise this. Ignoring it won't make it go away. It will follow you, wait for you, burrow into the cracks of your life until it's too late to fight back. I don't know what the symbols want, or why they choose the people and places they do. But I do know this, they're growing. Whatever force is behind them, it's expanding, reaching farther, pulling more of us into its orbit. And if we don't acknowledge it, if we keep burying the evidence, pretending it's just a trick of the mind, then one day it won't need to hide anymore. So consider this my plea. Not just as a detective, but as a man who's seen what lies beyond the edges of reason. Stay vigilant. Watch the shadows. And if you ever find yourself staring at those impossible lines and curves, those spirals that twist forever inward, don't look too long, because the longer you stare, the more certain you'll become that something is staring back. Before I end this, there's something you need to know. This recording, this account, it wasn't meant to exist. Officially, this case doesn't exist. The files have been sealed, the reports erased, and every trace of Sarah Chapman's name has been buried deeper than I ever thought possible. I don't know who or what wants this silenced, but they've gone to lengths I can't begin to comprehend. The timestamps on my notes have been altered. Photographs I took myself show angles I never captured, details I never saw. And the journal? It's gone, vanished from the evidence locker without a single record of its removal. Yet somehow, pieces keep resurfacing. A colleague found one of Sarah's drawings stuffed into the back of an unrelated file, a spiral etched in fading ink, pulsing faintly under the fluorescent lights. My body cam footage, which I thought was corrupted, now shows frames I never recorded, glimpses of shadows that weren't in the room, flashes of symbols I never saw. Then there's the final timestamp. The last note I wrote on this case was logged at 3:12 a.m., weeks after I'd been ordered to stand down. I have no memory of writing it, but it's there in my own handwriting, scrawled across the back of an unrelated report. It's already here. But here's the part I can't explain, the part that keeps me awake at night. This recording, I didn't make it. At least, not all of it. Some of these words, these exact words, I don't remember saying. It's as though they've been layered, stitched into the fabric of this account, pulling threads from memories I don't even have. And yet, as much as I wish I could deny it, I know this. The symbols aren't just following me. They've become a part of me. I see them when I close my eyes, feel them in the hum of silence when the room is still. Sometimes I even hear them. Soft whispers at the edges of my mind, calling me back to Blackwood Avenue, as if something there is unfinished. So I leave this with you, not as closure, because there is none, but as a reminder, a question you'll never want answered. If you've come this far, if you've heard the echoes of what I've seen, ask yourself, what if it's already watching you too? And if it is, how long will it let you look away?